The morning started like any other suburban skirmish. Coffee, a mailbox full of notices, and the unease that comes from knowing your neighbor's property lines are basically suggestions. I had lived on this street long enough to know the rhythms. Lawnmowers on Saturday, kids trading baseball cards at dusk, and Mrs. Henderson's hydrangeas that defied climate and common sense. I had lived here long enough to love the old maple that shaded the front yard, the one my father planted the year I was born. So when I saw the men in orange vests and chainsaws at the edge of my yard, my heart did something it shouldn't. I jogged out in my slippers, hair a mess, coffee cooling as my stomach clenched like a fist. "Excuse me," I said, which felt terribly formal for what followed. "What are you doing?" One of the men glanced up and waved his hand as if I were an interruption to a well-rehearsed play. "HOA order. Tree is overhanging common area. We're clearing it." "HOA order?" I echoed. "Since when do they get to bring a crew without notice?" "That tree is on my property." A thin woman with a clipboard emerged, heels clicking like a metronome. She had that particular kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of knowing she can, at least in her own mind, bend rules to her will. I had seen her at meetings. I had seen her on the community Facebook page. She was the sort who collected grievances like other people collect stamps. "We sent multiple notices," she said, voice buttery and sharp. "We have authorization from the board. This is for safety. The tree's roots are encroaching on the sidewalk." She smiled in a way that was supposed to be kind. It landed like a stone. "I didn't get anything," I said. "You can't just show up and cut down my tree." She sighed. "Look, property lines are complicated. For the safety of the neighborhood, we have to take action when necessary." That was when I noticed a small sign stuck in my yard behind the digger, a printed letter with the HOA seal and typed dates. The date at the top was yesterday. I held it up. "This says you gave me notice yesterday," I said. "I didn't receive it." The clipboard woman didn't look surprised. She looked satisfied. "When mailed, notices are considered delivered within 3 business days," she said. "Chain of custody and all that. We've followed procedure." "That's not how that works," I said, trying to keep things calm because I'd seen how these things escalated and I liked my house and my morning and I didn't fancy a legal fight before noon. "If you had concerns, you should have called. We could have." "All right," she said, tone closing. "Stand down?" "No. We're clearing it." The chainsaws roared like a metal choir, and the morning air filled with the sharp smell of sap. The maple groaned, an ancient sound that made my chest ache. I watched as limbs fell in practiced arcs and men dragged them away. I took a step forward and then stopped, not sure whether to tackle a man in an orange vest or to dial a lawyer. "Sir," the woman said, her voice sudden and cold. "If you interfere, we'll have to call the sheriff." I laughed because adrenaline makes people do stupid things. "Call whoever you want. This tree isn't yours." As if summoned by future headlines, a patrol car slid into the gutter at the end of the street. The sheriff himself stepped out, tall and polite in the way people are when their job is waiting for permission slips to turn into problems. He had a presence that made the men in orange vests straighten like sentries, and he tipped his hat as if decades of goodwill had made him incapable of being suspicious. "Morning," he said. "Everything okay here?" HOA said the tree was a hazard, the clipboard woman told him. "We followed protocol." He looked up at the maple with a slow, studied gaze. "Is it on their property?" he asked me. "It is," I said, "and I didn't receive proper notice." He nodded, the kind of nod that processes facts like a machine. "All right, I can make a report, but if they followed HOA protocol, there may not be anything criminal here. Civil matter." He turned to the men. "We can stay if needed, but I need to make sure everyone keeps the peace." I felt small and oddly grateful. A sheriff's calm can be a warm blanket in the cold of bureaucracy. The men slowed. One of them climbed higher, sawing a thick limb that stretched toward the road. I breathed, watching as the offenders of my family history became smaller with each slice. Then someone shouted. A motor hummed and pitches shifted when a truck that had been idling nearby miscalculated and reversed, clipping a fallen branch. A little chaos, a scuffle of papers, a coffee spilled on a clipboard, and all at once balance tipped. The limb the men were cutting gave way faster than anyone expected. For a beat it hovered, the world holding its breath. Time dilated. The limb began to fall. No one saw the sheriff's car, parked a little beyond the curb, at an awkward angle with the passenger door open while he took down some notes. The maple's limb came down in a slow, impossible arc and landed with the kind of catastrophic grace that renders everything else inconsequential. Wood against metal sang a horrible duet. Sound exploded. Glass popped like a chorus of tiny gunshots. The sheriff blinked, then reached for his radio with a reflex older than protocol. The sheriff's cruiser was pinned, a maple limb sprawled across its hood like an accusation. The men in orange vests went quiet, as if they'd been turned off by some unseen hand. Someone started yelling. The clipboard woman pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes wide, and for a second she looked very small. I stood there, chest pounding, coffee forgotten, staring at the ruin of black paint and silver trim. The maple had taken a piece of my life and used it as a cudgel against civic order. I felt an absurd burst of emotion, guilt, relief, outrage, and a ridiculous sense of vindication, all braided into one. "Is anyone hurt?" the sheriff demanded, voice snapping into command. His face was pale, a dog trying desperately to appear unruffled. No one was hurt. The men were shaken, lumberjacks of the modern HOA. The sheriff checked his radio and cursed softly when it sputtered a half-broken signal. He stepped around the limb and looked at me with something like apology. "I'm fine," he said. "I'm okay. But that is one expensive hood." The clipboard woman, who had been so sure of the rightness of her actions moments earlier, began to change her tune. "This is regrettable," she said quickly. "We are investigating the contractor. We'll cover repairs if necessary." There was a brief silence, as though the neighborhood itself were catching its breath. Then a voice from down the street called out, sarcastic and sharp, "Well, that's one way to stop the HOA." Laughter rippled, nervous and a little wild. People came out of their houses, attracted by the spectacle and gossip like moths to a porch light. Phones came up, amateur reporters grinning into their screens. The scene became an unintended community meeting, and like all good meetings, it devolved into opinion. "You gonna hold them accountable?" someone asked me, half a challenge, half a cheer. "I'll do the right thing," I said, though I was still trying to parse what right looked like when a tree, a neighborhood, and a law enforcement vehicle all ended up entangled. The sheriff was speaking into his radio, checking VIN numbers, and taking statements. The contractor huddled, ashamed and apologetic, while the clipboard woman kept making notes as if documenting a victory she suddenly couldn't taste. It would have been easy to write it off as accident, a confluence of errors and poor timing. But the truth is the HOA had acted with haste, and part of me felt the tree had been an accidental instrument of cosmic irony. The sheriff walked over and lowered his voice. "If you press charges, it's a civil matter," he said. "But you can file a complaint. HOA needs to follow its bylaws. Will you be all right?" I asked. He grinned, crooked and tired. "I've been worse. Just goes in the job description." We exchanged numbers because that's what people do when they suspect the world might tilt again. He said he'd be in touch for the report. He also said, with a note of humor that cut the tension, if the tree had known what it was doing, it chose a dramatic exit. The HOA sent a formal apology the next day, with language that tried to sound sincere and legal at once. They promised an internal review, a refund for damages, and assurances of better communication. There were photos released in an email chain that showed the limb across the sheriff's hood, the windshield spiderwebbed like bad poetry. People in the neighborhood debated whether the HOA had acted rashly or responsibly. The contractor apologized and offered to cover repairs. The sheriff's department filed a report, and the paper trail began its patient, bureaucratic crawl. But the story doesn't end with insurance papers and press releases. It grew legs, as suburban stories do, and walked right into the court of public opinion. The community Facebook page lit up with theories, memes, and a cartoon of a maple tree wearing a tiny sheriff's hat. Someone made a sign and nailed it to a post. "Think before you chainsaw." Another neighbor, in a fit of late-night creativity, spray-painted a small maple leaf on the curb with the sheriff's badge beside it. It was childish and perfect. I wasn't immune to the charm. There is a guilty pleasure in being at the center of a spectacle that feels like justice. At the next HOA meeting, people showed up who had previously only scrolled past event invites. They sat with their drinks and their grievances and watched the woman with the clipboard explain policy like a professor giving a lecture on moral hazard. The board tried to swaddle the incident in apologies and procedure. Some demanded resignations. Some demanded fines. Some wanted a plaque memorializing the day's chaos. The chair read prepared statements, careful as a surgeon's cut. They fiddled with wording, and at one point I wanted to stand and tell them that paperwork would never be as honest as the dent in the sheriff's hood. I wanted something simpler. I wanted acknowledgement, an answer to why my family's tree had been chosen for a quick blade and a mailed notice that traveled like a rumor. The chair of the board, a man who looked like he'd eaten a spreadsheet for breakfast, read minutes and documents and made statements that were careful as a surgeon's cut. They offered to plant a new tree. They offered a settlement. They promised better notice. The sheriff showed up at the meeting too, because a sheriff's presence makes everyone behave better and because apparently he had developed a taste for citizen theater. He did not wear his uniform. He sat silent and let others speak. When he finally did, he said something that made the room quiet. This was an accident, he said, but it was preventable. Notices are supposed to be clear. People need to be heard. Trees are not just property lines. They are history. Whoever made the call didn't consider what that tree meant to you. It was, to my surprise, exactly what I wanted to hear. He didn't make law. He made a human point about respect. The contractor paid for the repairs to the cruiser because they had insurance, and because no one wanted a sheriff out of car, because a limb decided to audition for a demolition derby. The HOA voted to revise its notice procedures and to require in-person verification for any action that affected private property. The clipboard woman resigned, citing personal reasons, and the community had a brief and gleeful moment of victory. But the maple kept living in my yard, scarred but stubborn, a living headline. I pruned it myself that winter with a steady hand and a quiet swig of tea. People would stop and tell me that they remembered their own memories under its branches. It became, in a way, more than before, an emblem of neighborhood stubbornness and the small absurdities of communal life. Sometimes when the wind pushed the leaves just so and they rattled like distant applause, I'd think of the sheriff's hood and the morning that turned into a story. The world had an odd sense of balance. The HOA had tried to assert control and for a moment thought it had succeeded. The tree had other plans.